Hey, Larkin Rose here, and a few people asked me for my take on the recent Supreme Court ruling having to do with national health care, also known as socialized medicine. Frankly, I find it funny. I think it's hilarious. I understand why people who are still trying to cling to the Constitution and still imagining the authority it pretended to create, still imagining that to be legitimate, are going to be upset and outraged by this because it's just plain ridiculous what the ruling actually is. But I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing when tyranny becomes so obvious that even normal people, some normal people, not all, because a lot of complete buffoons are out there cheering for this because they don't have the foggiest idea what it means in principle. But I think it's good when thinking people can be shown that basically the Constitution is a complete and utter failure. In fact, it failed before the ink was even dry. You know, all men are created equal, except for the Indians that were killing and chasing away, and the black people that were owning, and, well, women don't really count, and a bunch of other... It was a joke from the beginning. And 2 seconds later, the Aliens and Sedition Act, they were locking people up for criticizing government. It's never been what it pretended to be, and it's fallen apart more and more over the years. And the faster and more obviously that happens, the quicker people, hopefully, will give up their belief in the completely insane concept of limited government. There is no such thing. There can be no such thing by definition. And if nothing else has taught you that, hopefully this ruling and the rationale behind it will. Actually, everyone in the country should have already figured that out after the case of Wickard versus Filburn, in which the United States Supreme Court, or Supreme Court of Retroactive Tyranny Justification, because that's what they are. I mean, really, if you think the Supreme Court sits down and says, we're going to objectively examine this and see if this matches what the Constitution is, come on, that has not been true for probably forever, but at least for the past 100 years. And if anybody even pretends that's the case after Wickard versus Filburn, they're just lying to themselves. They sit down with the agenda. You know, Roberts, in his writing the majority opinion, he did not sit down thinking, I'm going to figure out if this act is constitutional. He sat down thinking, my puppet masters tell me that I have to come up with some bizarre justification for why this fits the Constitution when I know it doesn't. All the mental gymnastics they go through, the ridiculous excuses, the twisting of words and concepts and principles beyond recognition, it isn't because that's what they really think the Constitution said. It's because they are appointed by tyrants who want them to come up with an excuse for why it's okay. Thomas Jefferson even said a gazillion years ago that if the courts are ever the final deciders of what's constitutional, we're doomed. Well, here you have it. Anyway, back to Wickard versus Filburn. This was a case that a farmer was growing his own stuff and using it on his property. And the Supreme Court said, oh yeah, the Congress can regulate that as interstate commerce. Now you might say, wait a minute, that's not interstate. It didn't even leave his property. And if you're more observant, you might also say, and it's not commerce. He didn't trade with anybody. And you'd be right on both. Well, their brilliant rationale was, well, because he grew stuff and used it himself, that might have had an effect on interstate commerce, because had he not done that, he might have bought stuff from somebody else. And maybe when he bought that stuff from somebody else, it would have traveled in interstate commerce. That's really their rationale. In fact, that came up in the ruling and the current ruling about the socialized medicine, nationalized health care, in the dissenting opinion, as well as the main opinion. It's just ridiculous. And then ever since they made that completely idiotic argument, they can say, well, this is our jurisprudence, this is the case law. So they make a completely idiotic claim, and then they pile on top of that. Well, there's reasons why the current thing is even more idiotic than saying that a farmer growing and using stuff on his own land is interstate commerce. This is even more idiotic. Because this thing, one of the main things in question was the individual mandate forcing people to buy life insurance. And so basically, this isn't regulating commerce, even local commerce. It's regulating a lack of commerce. It's saying, we can force our agenda on you because you didn't buy life insurance. Really, they're trying to regulate a lack of commerce. But it gets even more stupid, because I think Roberts, to try to make it sound a little bit sane, and it actually made it worse, he said, well, they can't do this under the Commerce Clause, but they can under the Taxing Clause. We'll do it as a taxing power. Never mind that the law doesn't pretend to be that. He just kind of made that up as a new excuse. But that's actually more idiotic. First of all, the Supreme Court has said over and over again, license tax cases, Bailey versus Drexel Hill, and then there's a Butler case that also came up in this decision. Basically, Congress can't gain jurisdiction over new stuff by calling their control of it a tax instead of a regulation. You can't say, well, now it's a tax so we can control whatever we want in the whole world. Supreme Court said, quote, to give such magic to the word tax would be to completely wipe out the sovereignty of the states. Obviously. If they can do whatever they want in the form of a tax, they do everything as a tax and they rule the world. But it's also more idiotic than that. Federal taxes are supposed to be either direct and apportioned or indirect and uniform. Now this is indirect. They're not pretending it's going to be apportioned. An indirect tax is basically an excise or a tariff on particular activities. So what Roberts is saying is, well, this is an excise tax on not doing something. So they're imposing an excise tax, according to Roberts, of the main dude on the Supreme Court for Retroactive Tyranny Justification, and his completely idiotic attempt to rationalize this, said, well, it's a tax on not doing something, on not buying health insurance. And so, yeah, the federal government can certainly tax you for not doing something. Well, golly, why don't you expand that principle and have them impose $1 million tax for not juggling elephants? Just think of all the revenue they could raise if they put $1 million tax on everybody who didn't juggle elephants. That solves the deficit, doesn't it? It's completely idiotic. But beyond the legal excuse, for people to cheer for this is so unbelievably stupid. Here's these control freaks, and they come out and say, well, golly, we have this problem of not enough people have health insurance. I know. Make them go buy some. Really? You're going to cheer for that? You don't have something, and this brilliant socialist moron solution is force you to go buy it yourself. Like that's going to help. In fact, I think Obama himself even talked about, when he was against it before he was for it, when he used the example of homelessness as an example to make fun of this and says, well, duh, if that's what we're going to do, why don't you just go force all the homeless people to buy houses? Oh, we fixed homelessness. And then he turns around and does the exact same thing with health care. And by the way, it isn't health care, it's health insurance. There's a difference. But if you accept this rationale, what can't they do? And that actually, the Supreme Court asked that in the Lopez decision, where to save a little bit of face, they threw out the federal gun-free school zone law and said, there isn't anything in here having anything to do with interstate commerce. You're just pretending to have jurisdiction over everything. So the first federal gun-free school zone law they threw out, and the Supreme Court actually asked the government lawyers, we're under this rationale that there's some millionth degree vague effect on commerce that it might have. Because their argument was, well, crime near school hurts education, which is going to hurt people's ability to be productive, which affects commerce. I mean, it was this long, drawn-out loony thing. And the Supreme Court asked the government lawyers, well, what wouldn't this apply to? Can you think of anything that the government wouldn't be allowed to do under the supposedly limited Constitution? And the government lawyers said, oh, we can't think of anything. Well, now it's even worse. Now they can tax and regulate you not doing stuff, which isn't regulating. It's just butting into your life by force. It has nothing to do with any of the powers in the Constitution, nothing to do with anything rational. It's just they can force their way into your life for any reason at all because you didn't do something. And all the people out there cheering about this, way to just, cheer for complete totalitarianism. So I think it's funny. I think it's hilarious because I think it's, for thinking people, they may still be a minority, it's going to make them realize the Constitution's a joke. It was a joke from the beginning. It's a joke now. It's doomed. Why do we pretend it matters? Now, here's why this is significant. The only reason anybody looks at Congress or Obama or the whole crooks, the Supreme Court of Retroactive Tyranny Justification, the only reason anybody treats them with respect or pretends that anything they do is legitimate is because of that really old piece of parchment that pretended to create this authoritarian government and then pretended to limit it. But the only reason anybody imagines that those crooks in Washington have any right to do anything is because, this is the government that the Constitution created. So when they turn around and ignore the whole thing except we have power, all the limits, all the rules, all that's just out the window, and now we can do whatever we want. hopefully that'll make some rational people realize, if all the limitations and all the rules are bogus, then the whole thing is bogus. And they don't have any right to tell us to do anything. They don't have any right to take our money. We don't have any reason, we don't have any obligation to obey them at all. What it comes right down to is, as long as people look to the Supreme Court of Retroactive Tyranny Justification to tell them what government's allowed to do to them, they're just slaves. And the only thing, if nothing else told you that, this ruling ought to tell you that. They can do whatever they want to you at any time for any reason. Heck with jurisdiction, heck with the Bill of Rights, heck with any of that. None of it matters. And hopefully what people will come to realize is, it's not time to vote, it's not time to campaign, it's not time to appoint new judges or file new lawsuits, it's time to disobey. It's time to just disobey the crooks. How obvious does the tyranny and the lawlessness and the crooked thievery, how bad does it have to get before you stop asking the people in Washington to tell you that you're allowed to be free? If you're not going to resist now, you're not ever going to resist. Just march into the nearest cage. If you accept this, the Supreme Court, a retroactive tyranny justification, if you actually accept that, oh, well, they've decided, so it must be constitutional, I'm going to let them do this to me, you're done. You're finished. If you're still of the mind that you will only be free when your masters in D.C. tell you you're allowed to be free, you're a slave forever. So I hope this ruling, as just absurd as it is, wakes a few people up, makes a few people realize the whole joke, the whole mythology about government and the Constitution and representative republic. It's all crap, start to finish. These people don't have any right to tell you anything about how to live your life, what money you have to pay them, any of that. And hopefully this complete lunacy will nudge a few more people in the direction of giving up their belief in the mythological beast called government.